I'm Natasha Blackmore de Silva. I'm an Associate Director and Head of Planning and Architecture at Sheldon Bosley Knight. So I am a planner by profession. I'm chartered with the RTPI and I have a team of architects, technicians and planners. So basically anything that you want to do that you need planning advice for, whether it's conversions, removal of ag ties, new agricultural buildings, etc., come to us. I've got some business cards at the back and some brochures if you're interested, which show a variety of what we do and how we can help you. But today I'm going to be looking at permitted development rights for agricultural holdings, in particular Class Q prior approval. So as you may or may not know, there's been some recent permitted development changes that came into force on the 21st of May 2024. There's a variety of changes that have come in, main ones being an increase in the amount of floor area allowed to be changed under Class R, which is agricultural to commercial. That's gone up from 500 to 1,000 square metres. Also the inclusion of hotels in Class R commercial use. Previously, hotels did not fall into that category. And also a new iteration of Class Q, which is what we're going to focus on today. So back to basics, what is Class Q prior approval? It is basically a permitted development right that allows you to change agricultural buildings and now former agricultural buildings into residential dwellings under a streamlined prior approval process. So in 2024, in May, a new iteration of Class Q came in that made some changes to what you could and couldn't do under Class Q. However, they included a 12-month transition period that basically meant that the outgoing Class Q was still in play. That will end on the 20th of May this year. So if you want to use the old system, you need to have your application in and validated by that date. Otherwise, it will automatically be refused because you would have missed the deadline. So applications we're suggesting need to be submitted by late March to early April, just to make sure that they meet the cutoff, because it is taking councils quite a while to validate applications at the moment. And the last thing you want is to have your application in, you miss the deadline because of no fault of your own, and then you're back to square one with what you can and can't do. And just to give you an idea, it allows you to change buildings like this into buildings like this, if that's something you're interested in. So just a bit of a quick recap on outgoing Class Q. So the building must have been in solely agricultural use on the 20th of March 2013, or if it was built after this time, it has to have been in use for over 10 years. You were allowed to do up to 5 dwellings with a total of 865 square metres, and there was a mix of smaller and larger allowed. So a smaller dwelling is everything up to 100 square metres, larger between 100 and 465. There was a cap on larger that you could only do a total of 3. But there was room within that. So 2 examples we've got here, that you could do 2 larger dwellings, one of 200, one of 265. That uses your full 465 total, and 3 100s. So that gets you 5. That gets you your 5 units there. And what you could also do here is do 1 big 465, use all of that larger allowance in one, and then 4 100. This is obviously more of a sort of a mix that's very similar, but this one you'll have like 1 big unit and 4 much smaller units. So new Class Q changes that have come in last year. So if the building on the 24th of July 2023 was in agricultural use, or had been originally in agricultural use but is now being used for something else, that's now allowed under Class Q. So previously solely agricultural, now it's opened up some buildings that are potentially in equestrian use or traditional storage use, as long as they were built for agricultural purposes originally and they are on a farm which has agriculture still ongoing. They are now in play and they are eligible under new Class Q. However, they have given with one hand and taken away with the other with what you can do. So you can now do 10 units under Class Q, which is fantastic. More dwellings, previously it was 5. However, you can only, the maximum amount of floor area per unit has changed. So previously your biggest house could be 465 square meters. Now it can only be 150. So you can get more houses, but they're going to be more smaller units. What they've also added in, which is a little bit of an addition there, is that you couldn't do previously, is that if there is existing hard standing on site to the rear, you can build an extension onto the building as part of it, which you couldn't do previously, but this is still subject to the 150 square meter cap. So if you've got a building that's 150 square meters, you can't extend it. If you've got a building that's 100, you've got 50 square meters to play with, if that's what you want to use. And just as an idea here of what you can do, you could get 6 150 square meters and 100 square meters to use your full allowance of 1,000, or you could just do 10 100 square meter dwellings. I find that in practice, this system tends to work more if you have quite a few smaller buildings to work with, rather than a bigger building you're trying to subdivide into multiple units. So possibly already know this, but outgoing new class Q exclusions can't be done on listed buildings, conservation area, AONB, scheduled monuments. None of that's changed. If you're in an AONB, you still can't do class Q. Unfortunately, they did talk about changing that, but it didn't come in at this time. Assessment criteria, most of this has stayed the same. The maximum curtilage allowed is equivalent to the building footprint. If your building's 100 square meters, your garden parking area can't be more than 100 square meters. Flood risk is still obviously a consideration. If you're in flood zone 2 or above, you are going to need a flood risk assessment. Potentially mitigation can get you around being able to still do development in the building, but you need to actually get that sorted out by a consultant. Contamination still applies, but it's generally conditioned afterwards. So it's just mitigation. It doesn't stop you from doing it. It just means you may need to spend some extra money removing contaminants from around the building before you move it into residential use. Sufficient windows for ventilation, light and escape. That's really important, not just for planning, but for building regs. If you have rooms that don't have windows in them, they can't be bedrooms. So it does limit what you can do internally with that. Highways, whilst this has stayed broadly the same, they have added in an existing direct and safe access. So that does mean buildings in the middle of a field with no access to them potentially may struggle to get planning consent. And also conflict with nearby uses. So if you've got livestock buildings really nearby, you're going to struggle with that. You'll need a noise assessment, or potentially you'll need to demolish those buildings to show that they're not going to be used for a conflicted use. And as always, the building must be structural sound and suitable for conversion. That's not changed. The only difference is obviously don't expect when you're putting a new extension up, they are aware that bit will require some new structural elements to do. So where are we going to be in a few months' time? So after the 21st of May, the cumulative maximum permitted development will be 1,000 square meters and 10 units. However, this means that if you've utilised some of your class Q allowance under the old system, you do have some that you can use under the new system. For instance, if you built out 3 houses with a combined floor area of 465, so you maximise that under your outgoing class Q, you still have potentially up to 7 units because you had 10 and 535 square meters left under the new system. In this case, you would have been able to get 3 under the old system, which is your 465. With your 535, you could have another 5 units out of that are all under 150 square meters. So outgoing and new class Q rules, these have not changed. Council have 56 days to determine an application. If they have not given you a decision within that time, you get what they call deemed approval. So basically, if they haven't determined it in time, it's a yes because they haven't said no already. You've got 3 years to complete the conversion, and that's very important. Unlike normal planning applications where you have to have implemented, so you have to have commenced in 3 years, under Class Q, you have to have actually completed it. So bearing in mind, if you're doing an application for 10 units, you've got to have done all 10 in that time. It might be worth staggering your applications just to give you a bit of breathing space in between. And the main thing that you can do is you cannot mix and match. So if you apply under the outgoing Class Q, you cannot use new Class Q criteria. For instance, you can't build a house that's 465 square meters under the old system and then put an extension on it. So you have to pick one or the other. So I've got a couple of examples that we've done recently just to show you what is and isn't possible on site. So we had a building here that was capable of being converted into 4 dwellings, all of them between 110 and 115. So compliant actually under the old system as well as the new system, The reason we did this under the new system was because the building was actually now in storage use, not agricultural storage, traditional storage, which meant under the old system, you couldn't submit it under Class Q. Under the new system, because it was still on a holding that was still farming agriculturally, even though it wasn't in agricultural use, it became eligible again. And the client is now looking to apply for consent for a Class Q replacement, which is an ongoing next step that a lot of people do. Once they've got the Class Q, they apply to demolish it and then replace it with new build dwellings, which sometimes makes it a little bit more inviting to developers, especially if you have multiple units on a site. Next example here is Byfield Barns in Pinvin. So we actually got consent for the client under the old system to convert some of the buildings into 5 dwellings. They had to demolish quite a lot to get there because they had a cattle building right next door and a lot of other buildings that would have caused issues. After that, they got a Class Q replacement for 5 units. And then new Class Q came in and they realised, actually, this one works better for me, because they were intending to keep and rent out the units rather than selling them to a developer. So they went back in under new Class Q and ended up managing to get 7 dwellings, so smaller, but multiple, an additional 2 units. And what they were also able to do is, previously the cattle building that they had at the back, which was 1,000 square meters, had to be demolished, or was included in the planning application as being demolished because of the issues with the conflict. The changes to Class R, agricultural to commercial, meant they were actually able to retain and convert this building into self-storage use. So instead of having to demolish 3 buildings and retaining 3, they actually only had to demolish 1 small building, which was this building here, which was probably the worst of the bunch anyway. And demolishing that building meant that this one actually had a better outlook. So in the end, for this client, new Class Q ended up being a lot better for them. They were able to get more out of it and it benefited them more. And on top of the 7 residential units, they were also able to get 1,000 square meters of self-storage, which they've split into 10 smaller units, which can be rented out, and an additional income for the farm. So got a worked example here, but I know we're a little bit strapped for time. But basically we've got a building that's on an agricultural holding and is in storage use, not in an A&B or a conservation area, and the floor area is 925 square meters. It's structurally sound and it has an existing hard standing to the rear. So under the outgoing Class Q, this would not have been eligible for conversion because it is no longer in agricultural use. However, under the new Class Q, not only are we able to convert it, which is great, we can, because it's 925 square meters and it does have some hard standing, you'd actually be able to extend it as well. So you'd be able to get 10 units out of that with an extension at the back and max out the whole building if you wanted to. So in summary, Class Q allows for the change of use of agriculture and now former agricultural buildings into residential dwellings. There are several conditions and exclusions. Most of those have not changed from before, except for the fact that you can now make an extension to the rear, which previously you weren't allowed to do. Actually, in fact, you're also allowed to add solar panels on it, which you couldn't do previously. And you can still use the outgoing Class Q until the 20th of May. So if you're looking to if you've got a couple of larger buildings that you're looking to make into a few larger dwellings, now is the time to get those applications in. As long as they are in and submitted by the end of March, you've got a chance of going in under the old system and getting those units out. It doesn't stop you from doing something under new Class Q afterwards, but you are going to be limited to the size of units at that time. So it's worth, if you've got a big building now, considering what your options are at this stage. Everything is assessed against transport, noise, flooding, contamination. That's not changed. And after approval, work must be completed within 3 years. So if you're going to do multiple units, like I said, you may want to stagger your applications going in just to give you space in between to actually get the building up and running as a dwelling. And that is me done.